Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Worst Episodes of all of Star Trek. This video is part of a series of videos where I count down my top 10 least favorite, or worst in my opinion, episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. So I will be doing a full-length review for every single episode in my top 10 worst list of all of Star Trek. In this episode, I cover my number 6. My number 6 worst episode of all of Star Trek, and that is Turnabout Intruder, which is episode 24 of season 3 of Star Trek, the original series. So Turnabout Intruder is the episode in which a former lover of Kirk traps his body and swaps bodies with him in order to take over the Enterprise and be a starship captain. And she tries to kill Kirk, and that's in her old body, so that he can't reclaim his body. However, Kirk manages to get the help of Spock, McCoy, and Scotty, and with their help, he manages to switch back to his rightful body, where Janice Lester slowly goes insane. So, this is not a very well liked episode, although in my opinion I think it should be hated even more than it is. This was number 7 on Screen Rants List of the top 15 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, so it's only one up than mine. On IMDb, this is the 14th lowest rated episode, and in my opinion that's rated 13 slots way too high. And there are plenty of other worst lists that have this episode on it. Now, there's several angles in which I could attack this episode, or structure this review, so to speak. I could talk about Kirk's overacting. I could talk about the shameless body swap trope and how unoriginal that is. I could talk about the trope of the court martial, which is unoriginal, and Trek has done this several times before. But instead of doing any of that, I am going to address the sexist elephant in the room first. And that is to talk about the real reason and why this episode is my number 6 worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, and also it is my number 1 worst episode for Star Trek the original series, and that is the very blatant sexism, which is, I think, elevates this to a bad episode to the worst episode that the original series produced. Now, there have been some pushback or some different perspectives on the sexist messaging of this episode. My personal opinion is that this is the most problematic episode in terms of social commentary of the entire Star Trek franchise. Now, I know a lot of people would actually give that honor to Code of Honor of Star Trek The Next Generation, which is incredibly racist. And indeed, that episode is really terrible as well, and does deserve a lot of the ire that it gets. But I personally would put Turnabout Intruder slightly higher in terms of the most offensive or the worst social commentary. As even though Code of Honor is incredibly racist, as I talked about when I covered it for my Star Trek Next Generation Season 1 review, I believe it was unintentionally so. I mean, don't get me wrong, it still comes off. It is a racist episode. But I give a bit of sort of leeway, or a bit of, I don't know, I give some leeway to the writers and creators of this episode that that's not what they intended. That they just that it was just a bad episode. It was poorly written, poorly directed, and just a lot of people fumbled the ball along the way, and that they were relying too much on old-time tropes of Orientalism or others, or portraying Africa, or the Middle East has strange, weird places, which is of course a very Eurocentric, white-centric way of looking at these places. And so that, of course, is very common actually in 20th century literature, but it actually has no place in Star Trek in the 24th century. And I don't think these people were just lazy in trying to emulate these other literary works without realizing how racist this would come off has put into the 24th century. So it is a racist episode, and it's a very terribly written one. It didn't make my top 10 worst, although I'm starting to think maybe it should have, but it definitely would have made my 20 worst. But the reason why I personally consider Turnabout Intruder to be slightly worse than that episode in terms of offensiveness and really messing up social commentary is that I do believe, in my opinion, and this opinion, of course, is based off of a very rigorous and detailed analysis of this episode, but in my opinion, this episode was intended to be sexist. Now, I have heard the opinion, I've read the opinion several times, that the same thing happened with this episode, happened with Code of Honor, where they didn't intend it to be sexist. It was just so horribly written that it came off that way, and it turned out to be that way, but I disagree. I think it is interwoven into the very makeup, the very fabric of this episode, that was the intention of this episode, was to tell women to put down. It was a reaction to the women's right movement, and to put them down and say that they're being ridiculous, that they should just go back to the kitchen and shut up. And that is very much my opinion, and I'll get into a lot more detail about how I came to that conclusion. Now, I had talked about this episode when I did a video for my top 10 best episodes of the original series, because I started that video by getting into my top 5 worst episodes of the original series, and this, of course, was my number 1. And in that video, I talked about how sexist I believe this episode was. And I've gotten many comments that were pushing back against that. One comment in particular thought that I missed the point of the episode, that the point of the episode wasn't that women were not allowed to be starship captains, or that women were inherently incapable of being starship captains, but rather that this one woman in particular, Janice, what's her face? Janice Lester, that she was just crazy and incompetent and incapable of being a starship captain, and she was blaming the fact that she was unable to get the promotion that she desired due to her fact being a woman, when in fact that wasn't the case, and she was just using that as an excuse. Now, there's a lot of television, film, and stuff like that is very much open to interpretation, where a lot of interpretations are perfectly valid. One such example that comes to mind is the finale of BoJack Horseman. Without giving away any spoilers in that, there was a popular fan theory of what happened in the finale, and the writer of that episode, or the producer of the show creator, came out and said that specifically that theory was not what he had intended. It was not what was in his mind when he was crafting the final episodes of that show. But he stated that interpretation was still perfectly valid, and if that's how people chose to interpret his work, then he wasn't going to tell them they're wrong, and they were perfectly entitled to that opinion, which I think would hold to a lot of art. However, I do believe that there are cases where a specific interpretation is objectively wrong. Not only does it go against the author's original intent, but it also is a sort of false read of the text as it stands. And if one would closely examine the text as it stands, they would find that this conclusion is objectively incorrect. Let me give you an example for this. An extreme example. Let me throw out Schindler's List, for example. Let's say that someone interprets Schindler's List to be a completely pro-Nazi movie that talked about how the Holocaust was a great thing and that it should happen again. That interpretation of the movie Schindler's List is by, I don't know anyone who would disagree with this conclusion, but that interpretation is empirically wrong. It is objectively incorrect. It is a miscommunication, a misinterpretation that misreads the entire, not just the intent of the film, but the entire text and what everything is telling you. And I would be so bold to say that the interpretation of Turnabout Intruder that I just mentioned, that it was just about a woman who's insane, who's just using sexism as an excuse, when in fact it has nothing to do with the real reason why she was denied the power she deserves. I would actually put that in that same category as an objectively incorrect read of this particular text, and that everything in the text, everything in the subtext, everything in behind the scenes is saying that is actually incorrect and that is a false interpretation. Now granted, it is not to the extreme that I gave with the Schindler's List thing, but it is in the same vein, in my opinion, just as invalid. Now I think there are three things about this, because I've heard specific quotes and specific parts of this episode, rebuttals on how this is actually not saying that it's putting down women or that it's sexist in any way. However, I think when looking at specific lines of dialogue like that in isolation, you can make an argument about that. But I think this argument is dishonest because you're looking at it in isolation. You're not considering the other text in this episode that would actually contradict that particular interpretation, as well as the subtext, which really is pushing for the interpretation that I perceived, that it is in fact saying that women have no place in positions of power and that only men can do certain tasks or jobs or qualified. And so I'm going to get into the text, the subtext, and also the behind the scenes material, which also support this. Now, before I do that, though, I do want to talk about how when I was in college, when I went to university, I took a course of gender and race in the media, and we had to write an essay examining a piece of media as in terms of how it portrays gender equality and stuff like that. And I chose to write about this episode, Turnabout Intruder, because I had a lot to say about it. And I think it's a real shame that I lost that essay. I had it on hard drive, which broke, and I got to swap a new hard drive and swapped over, and it got lost in the shuffle. So I no longer have it, which I think is a shame because I think it was a pretty good essay. Just a side note, when I got my notes back from writing that essay, they sort of countered me by saying, "Oh, well, you should mention the fact that Star Trek was actually, the original series was very strong in promoting women roles and equality for women and whatnot," which led me to believe that the person who graded that essay didn't bother to read the whole thing, because I did in fact include that as part of my essay. But that's, I'm getting sidebarred here. Neither here nor there. But here's the thing, and let me address that now. I have heard a lot of counter argument to the fact, to the opinion that Star Trek, the original series, was very strong in promoting equality for women and women's rights. I do think there is a valid perspective on that, particularly how a lot of people point out this is some of the first time that women were shown in positions of power, and in fact a lot of people were against the fact that women were working alongside men on a military installation, which the original, I mean, I don't want to get into the whole argument whether or not Starfleet is military or not, but really parts, and especially the original series, were definitely shown to be, so let's just go with that. So, and yes, I do believe that's valid, but it's still, in my opinion, like, doesn't go far enough. And I know a lot of people like to excuse it as, well, it's just the time it was made in. That's the best they could do in the 60s. Which, I mean, I see there is a valid point to be had there. Like, that's true, but I don't know. In my opinion, it doesn't completely excuse it. And I did know of several people who actually found the original series incredibly sexist. And one woman I knew refused to watch it because of that. And she said she just couldn't deal with how they were all portrayed as being really weak and effectual, how they always like clung to men and showed vulnerabilities, like, oh, I'm scared, and always talked in really soft little voices. And mainly, you could say, I mean, the argument is, oh, they're working alongside men on a military ship, but most of their roles were to answer the phone, get the men their coffee, be nurses, typically seen as feminine role, and stuff like that. So I do see the counter argument to that. Now, in fact, I read a quote by the producer of the third season in which this episode aired, where he said, and pardon me, I don't have his name right in front of me, but he had said something along the line that the women in this show were there as space bunnies, basically just there to sex things up and look sexy, and that the thought of portraying gender equality wasn't actually the intention. The intention was to have some sexy chicks as scenery on the show as well, which I do think it could definitely be seen as a valid interpretation of that. Now, again, let me address Gene Roddenberry, who wrote this episode, because in my video that I did a few years ago, my top 10 best episodes of Star Trek, when I talked about the worst episodes, and this is my number one worst, I talked about how this episode was a sign that Gene Roddenberry left third season and how the show went downhill after that. And I had several people sort of correct me that he wrote this episode. And later, more recently, studying more about Roddenberry himself, I found that the sexist overtones were, in fact, coming directly from him. In fact, it was said that during the time he wrote this episode, he was going through a very rough divorce, where he was noted as saying things in public spaces, mind you, like writing rooms. He was noted as saying things like, all women are cunts that can't be trusted. A quote from Mr. Roddenberry. And that this episode was specifically reflecting the angst he was feeling after going through, during going through this really rough divorce. And that's why this episode is about an ex-lover of Kirk who wants to destroy him, despite the fact that Kirk showed her nothing but loved and really cared about her. And believe me, I have also gone through a really rough divorce, and I know from personal experience the agony over having someone you loved and still care about sort of think of you in a negative light and how rough that could be. But I definitely don't think that is any excuse to lash out at basically the entire women's liberation or women's right movement of the 60s, and just to like attack all women because of that. That is no excuse. And again, I'm still very much convinced that was the case. Now, okay, so let me talk a bit about the text, because as I said, I had heard this perspective several times that this episode wasn't in fact sexist. In fact, I went on IMDb and read a bunch of reviews, and a lot of them were saying that it wasn't, that it was basically saying it was about one crazy person trying to destroy Kirk, and the gender and sex of that person is kind of inconsequential, and it just doesn't matter. It's just about someone who's insane, and that's it. Which, again, I think that interpretation is factually incorrect. But let me get into some of these quotes, because as I was watching this episode for this review, because I rewatch all the episodes before I reviewed them, I actually took notes, which is not something I normally do, because normally I'm pretty good at keeping everything in my noggin for these reviews, but I wanted specific quotes, because I know they're there, that sort of support my position in this manner. So, one of the quotes, and let me get to this first quote, because this is the most common quote that I've seen defenses from of this quote. Now, it's when Janice Lester says to Kirk at the beginning of the episode, "Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women. It isn't fair." And Kirk responds to her by saying, "No, it isn't. You punished and tortured me because of it." Now, the common interpretation that I've seen of this quote a lot, even from people who don't like this episode, even from people who admit that this episode is sexist, they will say that this quote doesn't necessarily mean that Starfleet bars women as serving as captains. Rather, it's a more metaphorical sense of how Kirk his obsession with being a starship captain interfered with him finding romance or having a woman in his life. So it was more seen as a personal thing, that you were too obsessed with being a starship captain that you didn't care about me, or that you couldn't care about a woman because you're so obsessed with the starship. Now again, this is exactly the line I was referring to earlier, that if looked at in isolation, that's a perfectly valid interpretation, but when compared to the other text of this episode, and especially the subtext, that is very obviously not the case. And in fact, as I said, I've seen several critics who even, called this episode bad and sexist, defend this as, oh, that's definitely not what they're saying here. But it definitely is. Now, part of this is people's desire, Star Trek fans in particular, the desire to have an established canon, established lore. Because in canon, in lore, this is actually proven not to be the case. That because we see women captains in Starfleet, not only in the future, but some in the past as well. Most notably, Horrendez was portrayed in the in the show Star Trek Enterprise as the captain of the very second ship in Starfleet. So she was the second person to captain a ship in Starfleet. Has seen Star Trek Enterprise, which takes place some 100-odd years before this episode. And also, more recently, there was Star Trek Discovery that had Captain Georgiou as one of the most celebrated captains of Starfleet, and that takes place 10 years, roughly, before this episode. However, to me, there's this thing about people looking for in-reason or in-universe excuses to excuse or sort of make up for what is clearly inconsistent writing, which is something I talked about in a lot of areas, because the Star Trek is consists of 7 odd shows, It's lasted more than 50 years. The amount of writers who have come in all of these shows and films is insurmountable. And so it's going to be inconsistent. There's inconsistency is going to crop up. And from time to time, I know that people who like to stick to a specific lore, specific canon that binds the entire franchise together will often try to make excuses for these inconsistencies and interpret them in different ways to try to make it fit as if there was one law, one universe, which I'm not a fan of that, actually, because honestly, the honest truth is that it's a retcon. It's an inconsistent writing. Some writer came and wrote this episode, and years later, a different writer came in and took it in a different direction, and they just don't mesh. They're just inconsistent. And that's just the fact of life from a TV franchise that lasted over 50 years. So I personally just like to view it as that, as what it is. It's inconsistent of writing, as one writer had another idea and another writer completely contradicted because it worked for what they were doing in the future. And that's all there is, and that's all there is to it. I don't like trying to make up, like, oh, well, there's an in-universe excuse. For example, the one that really pissed me off is how the Cardassians are, in the first appearance of the Next Generation, portrayed as puny aliens who could barely damage the Enterprise, and 2 years later, all of a sudden, they're a superpower that could rival Starfleet, which is completely inconsistent. I heard some people trying to, well, maybe there was just a minor ship, or maybe they got in technology. No. I don't like hearing any of that. I prefer, that actually kind of upsets me. I prefer that you just say, hey, writers changed their mind. They originally envisioned the Cardassians as being weaker technologically, and 2 years later they realized for what they were doing they actually needed to be more advanced, so they just retconned it and changed it. Just leave it at that. That's what I prefer. And that is the case here, with especially both examples of women being in Starfleet before Janice Lester were filmed like 40 odd years after this episode. So it's obviously they retconned it. And usually, let me be clear, because I usually use the term retcon in a negative light. I usually use that to mean, particularly like with Bashir's genetically enhanced abilities, that's like one of the worst cases of a retcon in my opinion. That's just the writers completely changing their minds and completely changing the text. But in this case, this is a very positive retcon. They should have retconned. There's no way they should have stuck to this specific lore as established here, that women cannot be captains in Starfleet, because that would make no sense, and that's stupid, and this episode's sexist and shouldn't be honored at all. And so I very much approve of that retcon and think it was the right thing to do, and it was a great retcon. But it is a retcon. And the fact that this statement here was proven incorrect doesn't change the intention of this episode. It doesn't change the meaning of this line. And in the context of this episode, it is definitely meant to mean that women are not allowed to serve as starship captains. Now, let me get into more specifics on why I feel that is and why I don't ascribe to that other interpretation that this is just about Kirk's personal romances and his love of being a starship. Because, as I said, there's subtext and text that contradicts this. When you have to place that line in the greater context of this episode and not look at it in isolation. And there's another specific line that also, and several that imply, but there's some that also go along with this fact that women are not allowed to serve in Starfleet. One example is during the court-martial when Lester in Kirk's Body is trying to convince everyone that Janice Lester's just insane and she couldn't captain the starship. He says, or she, pardon my pronouns, but Lester in Kirk's Body says, do you expect Starfleet to place this person in command of the Enterprise? And it's very obvious by the way he says that, person, that the implication is woman. and that he's trying to be like courteous or whatever, talk around, and he didn't want to use the word woman because he didn't want to be too obvious and be like, so he's like, oh, person. But the implications there is definitely that women cannot command a starship. Like, do you actually expect Starfleet to allow a woman to command the Enterprise? Ha! You're crazy. That is the clear implication there. Now, if you're still not convinced, there's even more text to support this. As Lester and Kirk's Body, when Spock is on the stand, she tries to blame Spock for also trying to mutiny or take away his command. Where Lester as Kirk says that Spock is doing this knowing that she, referring to Janice Lester, that she would not be allowed to serve as the captain. Therefore, Lester and Kirk's Body accuses Spock of wanting to take command for the ship himself, because if he relieves Kirk of command, then Janice Lester obviously couldn't take command because she would not be allowed to serve as captain. So then the command would then fall to Spock. So the implication is also very, very clearly that a woman would not be allowed to serve as the captain. Also, let me hold off before I get into some of the subtext of this episode, because the subtext also very strongly goes along with this. But anyway, there's some other lines of import that also support this, meaning that it's about women not being happy. Women who try to strive for equality and want to do, quote unquote, the work of a man are just being power hungry, unreasonable, and not happy with their womanhood. So, this is a line from Kirk in Lester's Body, trying to prove who he really is, who says that she's doing this to get the power that she craved, to get a position that she doesn't merit by temperament or training. Now, I want to read the rest of the quote, but let me pause for a second there. By temperament or training. Now, of course, a lot of people who have that other interpretation of this episode would focus on the term training and just see, well, you see, it's just about Janice Lester, how she's not qualified to be a starship captain. But I would actually focus on the word temperament, which typically refers to one's personality or the way they present themselves, but from a biological factor, from a not something that is learned, but rather something that is inherent to one's being, is something that one cannot change, like, oh, I don't know, being a woman, and like one's gender, which I think that is definitely code for being a woman. Temperament, which I think is more important than the word training. But anyway, to continue with the quote from Kirk and Lester's Body, and most of all, she wanted to murder James Kirk, a man who once loved her, but her intense hatred of her own womanhood made life with her impossible. That, I think, is a very important telling sentence right there. Her hatred, intense hatred for her own womanhood. Now, I've watched reviews and I read reviews of other people exploring that this maybe is exploring some psychological problems or inherent issues with Janice Lester and people with severe psychological problems who are unhappy with themselves or unhappy in their own body. In fact, I heard some people imply that this may be getting into particular, transgendered issues of people who are who are unhappy with their assigned gender at birth. But I think that is giving this episode way, 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 way too much credit than it deserves. It definitely wasn't thinking of anything complex like that, and I think my gut interpretation, which again is backed up by all the rest of the text of this episode and the subtext of this episode, is that what they mean by her own intense hatred of her own womanhood is obviously referring to the fact that she can't learn her place and stay in the kitchen. That's basically what it means. What it is saying, very blatantly in my opinion, is that the women's liberation movement and those fighting for equality for women are just women not being happy with being women wanting to do men's jobs instead. They want to be like men. Therefore, they're unhappy with their own womanhood because they want to do jobs that women have no right doing, like positions of leaderships and being starship captain, where they should just stay in the kitchen. That's, I think, very blatantly what is meant by her intense hatred for her own womanhood, which again is supported by the rest of this episode. She's trying to get a position that she doesn't merit because she's a woman. By temperament, code word. Anyway, let me get back to this other quote, which, again, your world of starship captains doesn't admit women. It isn't fair. And Kirk says, no, it isn't. You punished and tortured me because of it. Now, a lot of people initially interpret this as when Kirk says, no, it isn't, after Lester says it isn't fair, of him agreeing, no, it's not fair that women are allowed in my world of starship captains. But I think that's too fair of an interpretation. My interpretation, something I think is a lot more blatant, is when Kirk says, no, it isn't, he follows that up immediately by saying, it's not fair, you punished and tortured me because of it. Ergo, he's not saying, oh, it isn't fair that you couldn't be a starship captain because you're a woman. He's saying, it isn't fair that you punished me and tortured me just because you're unhappy with your position. That, I think, is the very blatant message here. That Kirk, and in fact the whole episode is completely on Kirk's side, by the way. Like, Janice Lester is the clear villain of this episode. And it's completely on Kirk's side, saying that, oh, you were a total bitch to me, and you were mean to me, and you were unfair just because because you couldn't get equality, just because you couldn't be a starship captain. Quit whining about it, know your place, and stop bothering me for it. Jeez. That, I think, again, all the subtext, all the text, all the behind the scenes supports that interpretation, which I think is very clearly what is meant by that. Now, I want another important line in the text that I want to talk about is the final line of the episode, which consequentially was also the final line of the entire show. It is kind of sad that this show's legacy, its final line, would be such a very sexist one. But anyway, the final line of the show is after, Kirk saves the day and he's back in his own body and Lester can get the psychiatric help she needs. He says, her life could have been as rich as any. If only. If only. And he trains all. And says, if only. And I've heard a lot of people fill in that blank. They're like, oh, if only she wasn't crazy. If only she didn't have this mental illness. If only if she was more happy with herself. But again, I think very clearly the text and subtext and everything about this episode, when I finished that sentence, if only she could just learn her place and stay in the fucking kitchen. That is the completion. That is the rest of of that sentence. And I think that's very clear. In fact, there was a novelization of this episode, and they did finish this line. It said, her life could have been as rich as any woman's if only she learned the beauty of being a woman, or something along those lines. Which again, is just code for know your place, stay in the kitchen, don't try to do a man's job like Command a Starship, which I think is very clearly the message they're saying. Now, let me get into some of the subtext of this episode. Now, the subtext is something that most people, most critics I saw, maybe not these interviews, maybe not these user reviews on IMDb I saw, but most professional critics would agree that the subtext of this episode is incredibly sexist. And in fact, to me, I said, again, the subtext reinforces the sexist interpretations of the overt lines of dialogue, as well as other lines of dialogue support that. But anyway, the subtext here is a hysterical woman. In fact, Scotty in this episode even refers to Kirk, who is really Lester in Kirk's Body, as hysterical, which is a very dangerous trope, because women were very often, particularly in the 50s, 40s, but honestly still to this day, maybe to a lesser degree, but dismissed for being hysterical. I mean, there's the whole thing about women who were depressed or unhappy with their lives, mainly because they were being discriminated against as they were expected to just stay at home, stay in the kitchen, were given like shock therapy, shock treatment, and that they're often, even nowadays, to this very present day, like they're more likely, their medical concerns or concerns are more likely to get dismissed as simply women being too emotional. And hysterical is particularly the word they would use to describe this. That it's just the stereotype of women being overly emotional and not able to make rational decisions and letting their emotions carry them and being hysterical. Particularly, a lot of people were using this to attack the women's right movement, and I think that's extremely clearly what this episode is doing. And that's why I would fight back very hard against the interpretation that, oh, this is just a random crazy person and they're sexist and inconsequential. Because I think it's because it follows the trope, it follows the line of speaking, and I think their gender was deliberately chosen, which is backed up by the fact that they constantly mention it in the text, in the lines of dialogue in this episode. It's constantly brought up. Clearly, her gender is not inconsequential. It was intentionally chosen to show women as hysterical and overly emotional. And first of all, when she takes over Kirk's body, she's unable to command the starship. She starts acting erratically, and other people note that that Kirk is acting erratically. And that's basically saying is because women are too emotional to be starship captains. And again, other people had a different interpretation. Oh no, it's just the one crazy person who's not capable of being a starship captain. Again, the entire text of this episode is reinforcing the fact the world of starship captains doesn't admit women. She didn't earn this position by temperament. And do you really expect that they would place just a person in command of the Enterprise? And Spock, of course, is trying to take command because they know that she would never be allowed to be the captain. So very clearly, this is saying that women are too hysterical, they're too emotional, and if they tried to be a captain of the starship, they would fail, they would let their emotions get the better of them, that only men can be in positions of command. Also, you have the character of the doctor. Sorry, I don't have his name in front of me, but it's her doctor friend, the lover, who supports her and helps her in her quest to take over Kirk's Body and take over the command of the Enterprise. Now, I've heard some people question why would he do this, because some people say because the episode is saying it's because he loves her, but they're like, but if he's in a man's body, he can't really carry on the relationship with her. But again, that's getting into LGBT issues, which this episode clearly did not intend and was not even thinking about. So that's definitely wasn't the case there. What I think was clearly the case with this Doctor character, he is a symbol, or as much as Janice Lester is a symbol for the women involved in the women's right movement, and how crazy they are and how stupid they are to think that they could do men's jobs. The Doctor character symbolizes the men who support the women's right movement, and therefore, pardon the phrase, but a lot of men would refer to him as pussy whipped, as someone who's just letting women control him, and therefore is silly enough to go along with the notion that women could actually deserve equality and could do men's jobs, and that he's letting his groins lead him and not thinking things through, and he was just pussy whooped, and that's why he was going along and enabling her ridiculous notion that she could actually do a man's job. I think that's very clearly what this Doctor character represents. Okay, so talked about the text, talked about the subtext. Now let's talk about some of this behind the scenes. Now, I already got into Gene Roddenberry and his sort of motivations for writing this episode. However, he himself was quoted once as saying that he, yes, intentionally wrote this. His intentions in this episode, he said it himself, was that women were not allowed to be starship captains. Now, he said this in retrospect, years later after he wrote this episode, so obviously trying to save face, and I'm sure he had a different perspective by then, where he tried to say that his intention was that Starfleet would have a glass ceiling, that they would have a limitation, that the Starfleet in this Federation, which generally speaking was portrayed as a perfect future, would have a fatal flaw, and he chose that flaw would be sexism, and that they would not lavish equality to women. And he said that also he regretted doing that, and that he felt that it was a mistake and that was the wrong thing to do. Now, let me fall back a bit to another kind of argument I've heard from particular critics against the notion that this episode is saying that women were not allowed to be starship captains. And I saw several people bring up number one from the pilot episode, The Cage. And honestly, number one was the reason why I thought that Roddenberry had a better view of women, that he wouldn't be responsible for writing something so sexist. But it turns out I was wrong about that. But here's the thing. A lot of people say, oh, well, there's already, forget about Enterprise or Discovery, there's already some text in the original series itself that came before this episode that shows that women can get positions of command. Now, I got several retorts to that. First of all, this is a pilot episode that was rejected. Now, granted, they did make this canon by bringing this footage back in the menagerie, but that was basically just to save money. It was never their intention to imply that the woman would be capable of being first officer. So it's not really the direction that this show was going in. But, you could excuse that maybe the Mirage, regardless, the menagerie makes it canon. Then I'll get to my second point. In that episode, Pike said that he's never been comfortable with a woman being on the bridge. Which implies that it is not commonplace for women to be in positions of command like that. Also, very much implies that she would never be promoted to a captain. The actual captain is just never happy with women being in command positions. And further, that episode, The Cage also portrays her as being a very stuck-up, computer-like woman, and therefore not very atypical. And they were kind of making fun of her for that, in fact. And the third thing I would bring up is the fact that that it was rejected, that this pilot was rejected because of the fact that there was a woman in a position of command. Therefore, I think that this, in the episode Turnabout Intruder, they weren't considering that to be contradictory to the fact that women couldn't get in positions of command. Therefore, I think bringing her up as a retort that this line was not intended that way is faulty. Because, as I said, the rest of the text, definitely the subtext, support that is definitely how that line was intended. Now, more sort of behind the scenes arguments that I could get into is I want to quote Leonard Nimoy. Has Leonard Nimoy cited as hating this episode and spoke out against it and was ashamed to be a part of it in retrospect. Leonard Nimoy confirmed that Roddenberry really meant for Starfleet to have such a rule that women could not captain a starship. Direct quote from Leonard Nimoy. His goal, referring to Gene Roddenberry, his goal was to prove, quote, that women, although they claim equality, cannot really do things as well, under certain circumstances, as a man. Like the command function, for example. What he set out to prove was that this lady, given command of the starship, would blow it. And that's really what the script was about. Just that simple. And William Shatner, who was also in that interview, agreed with Leonard Nimoy about it. So, yes, those involved in this episode will admit that that's very clearly the intention, was that women were not allowed to be starship captains and that they were, in fact, incapable of being starship. Let me make this clear. It's not saying, Gene Roddenberry tried to tried to retcon his intentions later on by saying, it's the flaw in Starfleet, but that's not how it's presented in this episode. It's not presented as a flaw that women are banned from being captains. It's presented as a reasonable rule that should be there, because the whole episode is about how women are incapable of being starship captains. Now, again, you could say, well, no, it's just the one Janice Lester specific character who's incapable, and because she has mental issues, it's not saying all women everywhere, which I would kind of argue that. If that was the case, if it was just saying, this one specific person, regardless of their gender, is just insane and incapable of being a captain, then why weren't there any lines in this episode saying that, of course, women are capable of being a starship captain, when she kept claiming, you're not letting me be a captain because I'm a woman? Why didn't anyone counter that? Well, that's not true. There's women captains everywhere. Women are perfectly allowed to be a captain. There's Captain Giorgio, who's a woman. Your claims are false. Nobody says that. Instead, they say things like, a position she doesn't earn by temperament. Or things like, do you really expect this person to be put in command of the Enterprise? Pfft, of course not. The text, I'm sorry. text, the subtext, everything about this episode is clearly stating that women are not allowed to be starship captains, and furthermore, they're incapable. It's not just there's this one crazy, incompetent person. It's saying this is what happens when you let women command a starship. And I'm sorry, that is very clearly the case. Alright. I know talking about gender politics and modern on the internet nowadays is so friendly and popular, and people are just, I'm sure the comments will be all kumbaya and saying, I respect your opinion, I totally agree with you, and I'll get tons of thumbs up. But anyway, really thought it needed to be said. I really thought I needed to clarify my position. But now that that's out of the way, yes, William Shatner's hammy performance is terrible in this episode. But furthermore, and I'm sorry, I'm not getting away from the sexism topic yet, it also really stereotypes women. His performance in particular. In fact, I read this one user review on IMDb saying that Shatner's performance was great. Sorry, I can't keep a straight face. Was great and respectful towards women, which this person's wrong. That's the gentlest, kindest way I can state that. Not only is Shatner's performance terrible, it is very offensive. He draws on stereotypes, again, the whole hysterical woman thing, but also the mannerisms and the way he behaves. I'm like, obviously trying to emulate a woman, which is often why I find these bodies from gender swap stories, or even not necessarily gender swap stories, but this isn't the last episode on my top 10 worst countdown that will deal with this, believe me, because I never liked them, because they always draw on the stereotypes as portraying women as very stereotypically, trying to find the right word, but it's just a stereotype that I think is offensive, and I don't think works. And I think Shatner's performance here definitely portrays that. And what's even worse is the one scene in which McCoy's talking to him and he's sitting there filing his nails, because this is Lester and Kirk's body, and it's there to indicate, ooh, look, there's a woman controlling Kirk's body because they're filing his nails. Get it? Because that's what a woman does, and like the way he's sitting is supposed to emulate the way a woman would sit. In fact, I found out that this episode actually, that Roddenberry's first script, it wasn't, because some people, including myself, guessed that Roddenberry, his original idea wasn't offensive, but that some other people took his script and they made it really offensive, but that in fact is not the case, where the script was actually more offensive. His original script ended with Kirk being unable to get rid of his feminine mannerisms and sort of complaining about it, until he sees a hot chick walk by and he gets his masculinity back. Oh my god. Oh my god. Alright, so yes, and this episode is terrible. It does have the court-martial trope. It is over the top. I mean, even barring its sexism, that any character, regardless of gender, would threaten mutiny and will threaten killing people, and it's just a terrible episode all around. It's one of the worst episodes. Anyway, my rating for Turnabout Intruder out of 10, of course, is a 1, the worst. Definitely the worst episode of the original series. One of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, in my opinion. It's the most offensive and socially unaware episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. Even more so than Code of Honor, although to be fair, Code of Honor is a very, very close second. This, to me, misses the mark even more, and is intentionally offensive. It is a direct response to the women's right movement of the 60s. much in the same way that The Way to Eden, which I already talked about, was a direct response to the hippie movement saying that they should just shut up and toe the line. This is pretty much saying the same thing to the women's women's liberation movement. They should just learn their place, be happy with being a woman, stop trying to do men's jobs. And to me, that's what makes this episode the worst episode of the entire Star Trek. Because this is antithetical. I mean, regardless of simply being a woman's issue or feminism or whatever, the entire Star Trek franchise is built on equality. You know, not the gender equality, racial equality, just the fact that people can live in harmony. And this is the one episode I think that is most embodies everything that is antithetical to what Star Trek is about. This is the most un-Star Trek-like episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. So much so where it's almost anti-Star Trek. So it didn't quite make my worst list of the entire, or my number one of the entire Star Trek franchise. It did make my worst list, definitely. It was up there. But I do think it is the number one worst episode of the original series. Anyway, got a bit upset with this one. That's it for my review of Turnabout Intruder. I will be back, hopefully, with a less politically charged review next week as I get into my top 5, starting with my number 5 worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. And if you'd like to watch more videos in my top 10 worst series, you can have a playlist in the description below that you can check out, which will have all the reviews I've done thus far for my top 10 worst episodes of Star Trek. And be sure to check out my channel as I finish this series up and do many more videos on Star Trek, as well as many more videos on other shows like The Expanse and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.